Louise and Stephen received good news in their third year of marriage. She could finally leave him. Your sister will be back in a month. For this month, you must continue to play her role flawlessly. On the other end of the line, Mrs. Zena's voice was as cold as ever. When it's all over, I'll give you 30 million. And you can live the life you've always wanted. Understood, she replied softly, her voice as calm as stagnant water, hanging up the phone. Louise looked up at the enormous wedding photo on the wall. In the picture, Stephen stood tall in his immaculate suit, handsome as a deity, while she wore a priceless wedding dress, smiling gently and radiantly. 3 years, she murmured, her fingertips lightly tracing the frame. It's finally coming to an end. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Subscribe us to read wonderful novels every day. Now the story begins. 3 years ago, the marriage alliance between two wealthy families shocked the world, and her twin sister Mona was the Kalin family's chosen daughter-in-law. But just before the wedding, Mona left a letter and fled. Dad, Mom, I don't want to be bound by an arranged marriage, but I know it's my duty. Give me 3 years to find my freedom. In 3 years, I'll return, to preserve the alliance between the two families. The Zenas had no choice but to summon their long-neglected twin daughter from the countryside overnight. Thus, Louise, who grew up in the countryside without even the right to attend family gatherings, became the substitute bride, bearing Mona's name. Stephen doesn't love your sister. He's in love with that scholarship student his family sponsors. Her mother coldly warned her on the eve of the wedding. Your marriage won't be easy, but just behave yourself. Endure these 3 years while pretending to be your sister. Louise remembered nodding obediently at the time. Of course she knew who Stephen was, a regular in financial magazines, Beijing's most celebrated young aristocrat, the object of countless socialites' desires. She'd also heard the stories about him and Pandora. The Kalin family sponsored an impoverished student who attended a prestigious university on scholarships. Stephen loved her deeply, defying his family's opposition to be with her, yet Pandora, cold and proud, refused to accept a love without blessings and chose to break up and go abroad. The Kalin family was overjoyed and immediately arranged a marriage alliance for Stephen. Married life turned out to be even more unbearable than imagined. Stephen's study was filled with Pandora's photos. He flew to Paris every week to secretly watch her, while his wife Louise wasn't even allowed in the master bedroom and had to sleep in the guest room at the end of the hallway. Louise tread carefully, striving to perfectly embody the role of Mona, to avoid jeopardizing the collaboration between their families. She devoted herself obsessively to being good to Stephen over these 3 years. When he worked late, she kept the foyer light on all night waiting for him, knowing his stomach was sensitive. She woke at 5 every morning to prepare nourishing kanji. Because he preferred quiet, she made herself the most silent presence in their home. Gradually, whispers spread through their social circle that Mrs. Kalin was desperately in love with Mr. Stephen, and Stephen's gaze when looking at her seemed to take on a subtle new quality. The photo of Pandora disappeared from his study. The weekly Paris trips ceased. He began remembering her birthday, would come home early when she caught cold, and even shared intimate moments with her. Louise almost believed that genuine feelings had emerged in this marriage of convenience. Until 3 months ago, Pandora returned. Everything returned to square one. Stephen's heart was once again occupied by Pandora. He began staying out all night, and the study was filled with Pandora's photos again. Everyone mocked Louise as a joke, yet she simply smiled quietly, neither making a scene nor causing trouble, because she had never loved Stephen. The only reason she stayed by his side was for the money and freedom promised by her parents. His love might have made her life easier, but if he didn't love her, she couldn't care less. No one knew that although Louise and Mona were twins, their fates were completely different. During Louise's birth, their mother hemorrhaged severely and nearly died. From then on, their mother looked at her with disgust, and their father, who adored his wife beyond reason, regarded her as a curse. At the age of 5, she was sent to live with a nanny in the countryside. She remembered that winter when the nanny's stove broke, shivering from the cold without even a thick cotton coat. Meanwhile, Mona was in a warm villa, dressed in an expensive woolen dress, cherished and pampered by her parents. 18 years of differential treatment had long worn away her expectations of familial love. Now, in just 1 month, she would receive the 30 million for playing Mona these past 3 years. Leave this city, and finally live a life truly her own. In a moment of joy, her phone suddenly vibrated, the screen lighting up with an incoming call. Stephen. She took a deep breath and answered. Hello, within 20 minutes, deliver some sanitary products to the club. Stephen's voice was as cold as ice. Make sure they're for overnight use. The call ended abruptly. Louise clutched her phone, instantly realizing who this was for. Pandora's menstrual cycle. Stephen remembered it more clearly than the company's IPO date. Outside, the rain poured relentlessly, From Kaylin's villa to the club, the normal drive would take at least 40 minutes, yet Louise still grabbed an umbrella and stepped out. The car got stuck halfway, and she glanced at her watch. 12 minutes left. Gritting her teeth, she pushed the door open and dashed into the rain. The rain quickly soaked through her clothes, and her high heels slipped several times on the slick pavement. Stumbling, she fell hard into a puddle, her knees burning with pain, but she had no time to dwell on it. Picking herself up, she kept running and finally reached the clubhouse at the 19th minute. Just as she was about to knock on the private room's door, a burst of raucous laughter erupted from inside. "Mr. Stephen, in such heavy rain, you really had your wife deliver that. It must take at least 40 minutes from your place to here. Pandora is in terrible pain." Stephen's voice was calm. "She'll find a way to get here. True, everyone knows your wife adores you. These 3 years, even with your heart belonging to someone else, she's waited without complaint," someone teased. "But honestly, Mr. Stephen, with such a beauty who's crazy about you, haven't you been even slightly moved these 3 years?" The private room suddenly fell silent. Louise held her breath and heard Stephen remain silent for a few seconds before saying, "No matter when. Between Pandora and her. I'd always choose Pandora." Such merciless words. Yet Louise wasn't saddened. Instead, she felt relieved. She waited until the conversation inside ended before raising her hand to knock. When she pushed the door open, everyone stared at her in shock. "Holy shit, right on time. Sis-in-law, how did you get so drenched?" Stephen stood up, frowning. "How did you end up in such a mess?" Louise handed over the carefully protected sanitary pad. "Didn't you say you needed it within 20 minutes? I was afraid you'd be anxious, so I got off the car and ran here." She didn't mention the fall she'd taken, nor that her knee was now trembling with pain. Stephen's expression shifted as he suddenly took off his suit jacket to wrap around her. "Put this on." Then he pointed at the feminine hygiene product in her hand. "Take it to the women's restroom." Louise nodded obediently and walked toward the bathroom. When she knocked, she heard Pandora's delicate voice from inside. "Who is it?" "Delivery of sanitary pads." There was silence for a few seconds before the door opened a crack. Louise handed the items through and turned to leave immediately. Back home, she took a hot shower, the wound on her knee throbbing faintly. Lying in bed, she thought about how she would soon be completely free, feeling an indescribable sense of relief. Just as she was about to fall asleep, the door was suddenly kicked open with a violent force. Stephen barged in, grabbing her wrist. "Get up." Louise hadn't even processed what was happening when she was violently dragged off the bed, stumbling as she was hauled toward the staircase. "Stephen, what are you?" Before she could finish speaking, a tremendous force sent her reeling backward. The back of her head struck the steps with a sickening crack as she tumbled down the entire flight. Excruciating pain instantly flooded her entire body. She lay at the bottom of the stairs, her vision blurred, warm liquid trickling down her forehead. "Why?" She struggled to prop herself up. "Treat me like this." Stephen stood at the top of the stairs, his expression unreadable against the backlight, but his voice was piercingly cold. "Pandora, was it you who pushed her down?" Louise looked up blankly. "What? Stop pretending." He descended the stairs step by step, playing the magnanimous one these past few months, just waiting for today, weren't you? "Do you have any idea that when you pushed Pandora off the windowsill, you caused her to fracture all over and nearly die?" "I didn't." She shook her head weakly, but the movement tugged at the wound on her head, sending a wave of dizziness through her. Stephen knelt down and gripped her chin forcefully. "Mona, have these years of my kindness given you illusions? Let me tell you once more, ours is a marriage of convenience, nothing more." He leaned close to her ear, enunciating each word deliberately. "The love you want, I could never give it to you." Louise saw stars from the pain and suddenly felt like laughing, but she had never wanted his love in the first place. Louise was about to speak when Stephen grabbed her arm and yanked her up, his face icy. "What are you pretending for?" His voice was as cold as ice. "Pandora fell from the 5th floor, and you just rolled down from the 2nd. Get up and go to the hospital to apologize to her." He dragged her out mercilessly, completely ignoring the blood still flowing from her forehead and the reopened wound on her knee, each step sending a piercing pain through her. Louise was forcibly shoved into the car by him, remaining silent the entire way. She gazed at the scenery rushing past the window, thinking only to herself, just endure a little longer, just endure a little longer, and soon she would be free. In the hospital ward, Pandora leaned weakly against the headboard, her face pale. A bandage wrapped around her wrist. The moment she saw Louise, she immediately shrank back, her eyes instantly reddening. "Stephen," her voice trembled like a startled fawn. I don't want to see her." Stephen immediately stepped forward, gently taking her hand. "Don't be afraid, as long as I'm here. No one dares to bully you." After speaking, he turned his head coldly toward Louise. "What are you standing there for? Apologize." Louise looked exhausted, yet unusually calm. She stared fixedly at Pandora and asked softly, "Miss Pandora, did I really push you when you fell from the windowsill?" Pandora's eyelashes trembled, and tears instantly fell. "Miss Mona, if you don't want to apologize, forget it. I never intended to cause you trouble," she sobbed, her voice filled with utmost grievance. "I know Stephen has been with me these days, so it's normal for you to resent me, but you two were only in a marriage of convenience to begin with, and he doesn't love you. If not for the disparity in our social status, he wouldn't have belonged to you." The more she spoke, the harder she cried, and Stephen's expression grew increasingly dark. "Mona," he snapped sharply, "I brought you here to apologize, not to provoke her. Are you going to apologize or not?" Louise closed her eyes. She knew Pandora was framing her, but she was about to leave. She couldn't afford any problems with the collaboration between the two families, otherwise she wouldn't get the 30 million, nor her freedom. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "it was my fault." With that, she turned to leave. "Stop," Stephen called out coldly, "since you were the one who pushed her, you'll stay and take care of her until she's discharged from the hospital." Louise's fingers curled slightly, and in the end, she still nodded. "All right." In the days that followed, Louise stayed by Pandora's hospital bedside without leaving for a moment. Stephen also practically moved into the hospital, setting aside all company matters to personally feed Pandora porridge, wipe her hands, and coax her to sleep. These were things he had never done for Louise, yet Louise never showed jealousy, quietly tending to Pandora with calm composure, as if none of this concerned her. The nurses whispered among themselves, "My God, I've never seen such a magnanimous wife before. You don't understand, this is the highest form of love," another nurse sighed. "Because she loves Mr. Stephen so deeply, she's willing to care for even the one he favors, just hoping he might glance her way. How pitiful." These words happened to be overheard by Stephen as he passed by. His footsteps halted, his gaze involuntarily drawn to the slender figure in the hospital room. Louise was lowering her head, carefully peeling an apple, her profile quiet and docile. Stephen felt an inexplicable twinge of something unusual in his heart. Pandora on the day of her discharge. Stephen directly told Louise, "I'm taking Pandora on a trip these few days. Don't contact me unless it's important." Louise nodded. "All right." Watching him walk away holding Pandora's hand, she felt an unexpected sense of relief in her heart. Finally, she wouldn't have to face them anymore. Back home, she started packing her luggage, preparing for her imminent departure. A few days later, she came across Pandora's social media post. Stephen had taken her to the Maldives, lit sky lanterns for her at an auction, and splurged on the jewelry she loved. Louise just glanced at it before calmly scrolling past. She doesn't care, she never cared in the first place. A week later, the Kalin family's monthly banquet arrived as scheduled. Stephen was absent, leaving Louise to attend alone. Stephen's mom darkened at the sight of her. "Where's Stephen?" Louise lowered her eyes. "He's busy and won't be back for now." Stephen's mom let out a cold laugh and was about to speak when the butler hurried over, handing her an entertainment tabloid. The headline prominently featured a photo of Stephen and Pandora locked in a passionate kiss on a yacht. Slap! Stephen's mom slammed her chopsticks on the table. Furious, "Mona, come with me to the study." As soon as they entered the study, Stephen's mom snapped sharply, "Kneel down." Louise silently knelt. "Worthless, you can't even keep your own husband." Stephen's mom trembled with rage. "Now you have two choices, either call him back immediately, or face the family punishment." Louise, her eyelashes fluttered slightly. She knew that even if she called, Stephen wouldn't come back, and she couldn't disturb his private time with the one he loved. If he got angry, the collaboration between their families would likely be jeopardized. "I choose the family punishment," she said softly. Stephen's mom flew into a rage. "Say that again." "I choose the family discipline." Louise lifted her head, her gaze calm. "Go ahead and hit me." Stephen's mom turned livid with anger, snatched the whip from the wall, and lashed it fiercely across her back. "Will you say it or not?" "Slap." "Will you call or not?" "Slap." Louise clenched her teeth tightly, her back burning with pain, yet she kept shaking her head. At last, the pain overwhelmed her vision with darkness, and she fainted outright. When she came to, she found herself lying prone on a hospital bed, her back swathed in bandages. Meanwhile, Stephen sat by her bedside, his brow deeply furrowed. "Why didn't you call me back when Mother gave you trouble?" he asked coldly. Louise gave a weak smile. "Didn't want to interrupt your date with Miss Pandora." Stephen froze. He stared at her pale face, suddenly recalling the nurse's words, "Because she loves Mr. Stephen so much, she's even willing to care for the person he likes." Was she really that in love with him? So much that she'd rather suffer punishment than disturb him? Stephen felt that strange sensation growing stronger within him. In the following days, he stayed at the hospital to care for her, Something completely unprecedented for him. Louise said no need, but he still didn't leave, until the day of discharge. Stephen suddenly received a call saying there was an urgent matter at the company and he had to attend a meeting. Go back by yourself. He dropped these words and turned to leave. Louise nodded and slowly walked out of the hospital. She had just stepped off the stairs when she accidentally bumped into someone. Are you blind? The other person shouted angrily. Do you know how expensive this outfit is? You look so shabby. Could you even afford to pay for it? Louise was about to apologize when a cold, sharp voice suddenly came from behind her. Get lost. Stephen had somehow gotten out of the car and flung a wad of cash directly in the man's face. Is this enough? The man initially wanted to lash out, but one look at Stephen's attire and aura made him slink away in defeat. Stephen cast a cold glance at Louise. Mona, didn't the Zena family and the Kalin family give you money? Is this how you dress? Louise remained silent. The Zena family had indeed never given her money, while the Kalin family provided a black card, yet she never used it, as she wasn't the real Mrs. Kalin. Seeing her silence, Stephen felt an inexplicable surge of anger and dragged her into the car without another word. Go buy some clothes. Inside the mall, Stephen picked out several haute couture outfits for her, each one exorbitantly priced. Louise remained quietly cooperative throughout, like an emotionless marionette. But just as they stepped out of the mall, Stephen, a trembling voice called out. Louise looked up and saw Pandora standing not far away, still wearing her part-time waitress uniform. Her eyes reddened as she stared at them in disbelief. Didn't you say you were in a company meeting, Pandora? Stephen's expression changed slightly. You don't have to love me. Pandora tears fell. But how could you lie to me? I shouldn't have come back. I've disturbed you too. With that, she turned and ran. Pandora, Stephen immediately gave chase. Louise stood still, watching his retreating figure with perfect calm in her heart. Yet in the very next instant, bang, a loud bang, the glass from the upper floors of the mall suddenly shattered, crashing straight onto Pandora's head. Without even a whimper, she collapsed into a pool of blood. Stephen's face turned pale as he rushed forward, scooping up the unconscious Pandora and bolting toward the hospital without looking back. Louise stood rooted to the spot, her fingers curling slightly before she finally followed. Under the stark white lights of the hospital corridor, the operating room's lamp remained lit. Stephen stood outside the door, his suit still stained with Pandora's blood, an uncharacteristic trace of agitation flickering across his usually composed face. Louise sat quietly to the side, saying nothing. The operating room door suddenly swung open as the doctor rushed out. What do we do? The patient is hemorrhaging badly and needs an emergency blood transfusion, but she's Rh negative and the blood bank is running critically low. Stephen furrowed his brows and was about to speak when Louise stood up. I'm Rh negative. I can donate. Stephen whipped his head around to look at her, a flash of shock passing through his eyes. Louise met his gaze calmly. Saving lives comes first. She followed the nurse to have her blood drawn, as 400 cubic centimeters of blood slowly flowed out of her body. Her face grew increasingly pale, yet her gaze remained calm throughout. Stephen stood by, watching the needle inserted into her slender arm, the strange feeling in his heart growing stronger. Just how much did she love him after the blood draw? Louise walked out pressing a cotton swab to her arm and saw Stephen still standing motionless outside the operating room. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over and said softly, Don't worry, she'll be fine. Stephen looked up at her, his voice slightly hoarse. Aren't you leaving yet? Louise shook her head. Miss Pandora misunderstood us. I need to explain things clearly when she wakes up. Stephen stared at her pale face and suddenly asked, Do you really like me that much? Louise was taken aback. She was just about to speak when the operating room door suddenly swung open, and the doctor stepped out. The surgery was successful. Once the anesthesia wears off, the patient will wake up. Stephen's tense shoulders finally relaxed. Louise silently stepped aside and said no more. Several hours later, Pandora woke up. The moment she opened her eyes and saw Louise standing by the bed, her eyes instantly reddened. Stephen, did you bring her here again because you want my blessing for you too? Louise quickly stepped forward and softly explained, Miss Pandora, you've misunderstood. That day, Stephen really had a meeting to attend. Taking me shopping was just on the way. It wasn't a date, and he didn't lie to you. Stephen also nodded. Our marriage is purely political. There are no feelings involved. Pandora bit her lip as tears fell. Then how can you prove it? Prove that you don't have even a shred of affection for her. Stephen frowned. How do you want me to prove it? Pandora thought for a moment, then suddenly pointed out the window. Throw her into the frozen lake. Stephen paled slightly. Pandora, you're hesitating. Pandora's voice trembled. You do like her. Stephen remained silent for a few seconds before finally sighing and turning to wave at the bodyguard. Throw her into the lake. Louise's pupils constricted. She knew Stephen would do anything for Pandora, but she never imagined he could be this ruthless. But she couldn't resist, she had to endure. The bodyguards dragged her out. Stephen stood motionless. His eyes dark and unreadable, the lake water was piercingly cold. Louise almost suffocated the moment she was pushed in. The icy water flooded her nostrils, numbing her limbs with cold. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay afloat, but her body kept sinking uncontrollably. The bodyguards by the lake watched her coldly, not a single one lifting a hand. Louise's consciousness gradually blurred, and in her daze, she seemed to see herself as a child, abandoned by her parents in the countryside. Without warm clothes in winter, shivering from the cold, she could only huddle in the firewood shed of the nanny's house for warmth. No one had ever truly cared about her in this life. After what felt like an eternity, Louise was finally pulled from the water. Her body was ice-cold, lips blue and purple. Already unconscious, in her dazed state, she faintly sensed someone wiping her body with a warm towel, the movements uncharacteristically gentle. She instinctively grabbed the hand and murmured, "Just hold on a little longer, we can leave soon." The next moment, that hand suddenly gripped hers back with such force it nearly crushed her bones. "What, leaving?" Stephen's voice was cold as ice. Louise opened her eyes in pain, realizing she had already returned to Kaylin's house. Stephen sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze dark and fixed on her. What was that about leaving just now? Louise felt her heart skip a beat and feigned ignorance with a hoarse voice. "Leaving? I must have been delirious from the high fever, talking nonsense." Stephen studied her for a long moment before seemingly believing her and released his grip. "Why didn't you mention your period? And you stayed in the lake for so long." Louise gave a weak smile. "If going in could make her forgive you, I'd rather not say anything." Stephen looked at her with a complicated expression and asked again, "Do you really like me that much?" Louise lowered her eyelashes. She didn't like him. She was just maintaining the relationship between their families. Once Mona returned, she could fly far away. The door suddenly swung open. Pandora walked in. "Stephen, when are we leaving for fishing?" Seeing Louise awake, she feigned surprise. "Miss Pandora, are you all right?" Without waiting for Louise to respond, she added with a smile, "Last time I was just angry when I told Stephen to do that. I never thought he'd actually throw you into the frozen lake. My apologies. I heard you were the one who donated blood for me. Why don't we go fishing together? Consider it my way of making amends." Louise was about to refuse when Pandora warmly grabbed her hand. "Don't say no, I've already settled it with Stephen." Stephen glanced at her, signaling not to spoil the mood. Louise could only nod in the end. On the luxury yacht, the sea breeze carried a faint saltiness. Pandora stuck to Stephen the entire time, coquettishly laughing as she had him feed her fruit. Apply sunscreen, and even playfully demanded he carry her to see the ocean view. Louise stood on the deck, quietly gazing at the horizon as if none of this concerned her. It wasn't until Stephen stepped away to take a phone call that Pandora approached her and suddenly said, "I really don't understand you sometimes." Louise turned to look at her. Pandora narrowed her eyes. "The rumor in the circle is that you're deeply infatuated with Stephen and would do anything for him. But shouldn't love mean possession? I framed you, forced you to apologize, and you showed no emotion. He threw you into an icy lake, and you showed no emotion. Even now, watching me be intimate with him, you still show no emotion." She leaned closer to Louise, lowering her voice. "Do you even like him at all?" Louise twitched her lips. Pandora was right. She truly didn't like Stephen. Before the words could be spoken, a massive wave suddenly struck. Both lost their footing and were swept into the sea simultaneously. The icy seawater instantly submerged them, the yacht's metal edge slicing long wounds on their arms as blood immediately bloomed in the water. "Someone's fallen overboard. Help, quick, save them." The deck instantly erupted into chaos. The rescue team swiftly jumped into the sea, but soon resurfaced with grave expressions. "Mr. Stephen, their blood will attract sharks any minute, and they're drifting in opposite directions. For safety, we can only save one at a time." Stephen turned pale, his eyes frantically scanning the turbulent waters. On one side was Pandora struggling desperately, on the other Louise being swept further away by the waves. "Save Pandora first. Pandora," he practically roared. Louise had already choked on several mouthfuls of briny seawater when she heard those words. She watched as the rescuer swam toward Pandora, saw Stephen's anxious face, smiled bitterly, and slowly closed her eyes. She should have known, in his heart, she was always the one who could be abandoned. Seawater flooded her lungs as her consciousness gradually faded. In her daze, she saw a dark shadow swiftly approaching. A shark. A sharp pain shot through her leg, and her final conscious thought was the image of azure seawater gradually tinged crimson with blood. Louise, when she woke again, the sterile white ceiling of a hospital greeted her eyes. "You're finally awake," the nurse exhaled in relief. With injuries this severe, We need to contact your family immediately. She paused, then couldn't help remarking, look at Miss Pandora in the next bed. She fell into the sea too, but with much lighter injuries. Yet Stephen hasn't left her side, doting on her like she's the most precious thing. Where are your family members? It's been 2 days already, and still no sign of them. Louise pursed her lips and remained silent. At that moment, the hospital room door was suddenly flung open. Stephen stood grimly at the doorway, his gaze piercing through her like a knife. The nurse froze, seemingly confused about why Stephen would appear here, but seeing his dark expression, she quickly retreated. The door had barely closed when Stephen violently overturned the medicine tray on the nightstand. The shattering of glass bottles pierced the air as pills scattered across the floor. Was it you who pushed Pandora into the sea? His voice was cold as ice. Louise froze. She couldn't comprehend why Pandora would still frame her. A wave of exhaustion washed over her. I didn't. Still making excuses, Stephen clamped down on her wrist with enough force to nearly crush her bones. Pandora told me herself. Weren't you always so magnanimous before? Why have you suddenly become like this? He let out a cold laugh, as if realizing something. Could it be, your previous tolerance was all an act, just to catch my attention? Louise turned pale from the pain, yet merely gazed at him calmly, not even bothering to explain. That look completely enraged Stephen. He abruptly shook off her hand. Fine, since you refuse to admit your mistake, then bear the consequences yourself. He turned and walked away, his voice icy and piercing. From now on, no medical staff will attend to you. This pain, you'll endure it alone. The following days were Louise exceptionally difficult. Without doctors making rounds or nurses changing her dressings, she could only drag her battered body to the medicine cabinet herself. Trembling as she applied the medication alone, several times, she fell to the ground, her knees bruised purple, yet she gritted her teeth and got back up. Stephen probably thought that she, the Zena family heiress, couldn't endure such torment, but he didn't know, she wasn't Mona, not some delicate socialite raised in a greenhouse. She was Louise, who grew up roughing it in the countryside. Abandoned by her parents from childhood and forced to endure even illness alone. What was a little pain to her? A few days later, Louise had just completed her discharge procedures and was packing her belongings when the hospital room door was suddenly kicked open with a violent crash. Stephen barged in with a dark expression, gripping her wrist tightly. Come with me. What are you doing? Louise frowned. Pandora has been kidnapped by Tyler, Stephen said with a tense voice. They specifically demanded you in exchange, promising to release you in 3 days. Louise felt a shudder in her heart. Tyler. That notorious pervert in their circle. Every time she saw him, his cold, lecherous eyes made her sick to her stomach. I'm not going. She refused outright. Stephen's eyes turned icy cold. You don't have a choice. He stared at her, then suddenly softened his tone. Tyler has taken a liking to you and won't harm you. Just behave, and after this is over, I'll agree to any condition you want. Louise looked up at him and suddenly smiled. Fine, then I want a wedding. Stephen startled. What? Back then we only got the marriage certificate, never had a wedding ceremony. Louise said softly. I want you to make it up to me. This was part of her plan. When Mona returns, she needs a grand wedding for everyone to witness firsthand the transfer of the Mrs. Kaylin title. Stephen remained silent for a long time before finally nodding. All right, I agree. Louise was brought to Tyler's family villa when Tyler lounged lazily on the sofa, smiling as he watched her. Mrs. Kaylin. Long time no see. His fingers traced her face, and Louise suppressed her disgust, refusing to pull away. The torment of the past 2 days was relatively mild. Tyler only had her blood drawn, tube after tube. The pain of the needle piercing her veins had numbed her, but watching her blood being collected into glass tubes still made her heart tremble uncontrollably. Until the 3rd day, in a half-dream state, she overheard the whispers of the bodyguards outside the door. Is the young master insane? Is he really going to drain her blood for specimens later? Sure, keep your voice down. The young master said she's too beautiful, that only by preserving her as a specimen after death can she be kept forever. Louise's blood ran cold in an instant. This was Stephen's promised nothing will happen. She was about to lose her life here. A bone-chilling cold shot up from her feet to her spine. She bit her lip so hard that only the taste of blood could barely suppress her trembling. Seizing the moment when the guards were distracted, she grabbed the crystal ornament from her bedside and hurled it at the window with all her strength. Crash! Shards of glass flew everywhere. Using the sharp edge, she cut through the ropes binding her. As she leapt from the 2nd floor, a sharp crack sounded from her right ankle. The excruciating pain made her vision darken, but she dared not stop. Dragging her sprained ankle, she stumbled out of Tyler's family and ran all the way back to the Kaylin family villa. When she pushed open the living room door, she saw Stephen kneeling on one knee. carefully applying medicine to Pandora's ankle. "Stephen," Pandora said with reddened eyes. "Miss Mona hasn't returned for so long, aren't you worried at all?" Stephen paused his movements, his voice impossibly gentle. "I only worry about you. Why didn't you tell me you sprained your leg? Do you want to break my heart?" Louise stood at the doorway, drenched from head to toe, her ankles swollen painfully high, yet not a single glance was spared her way. She walked past them with an expressionless face. "Louise," Stephen finally noticed her, springing to his feet. "You," his gaze swept over her, as if checking for injuries, before he finally exhaled in relief. "What happened these past 3 days?" Louise twisted her lips, cracked and bleeding. "It's nothing." She cut straight to the chase. "When are you going to deliver on the wedding you promised me?" Pandora looked up immediately. "What wedding?" Stephen paused briefly. "We're going to have a make-up wedding." Seeing Pandora's eyes instantly redden, he quickly explained, "It's just a ceremony, Pandora. You're the only one in my heart." Pandora forced a smile. "I understand, I'm not angry, you did it to save me." She suddenly looked at Louise and said softly, "Miss Mona, why don't I help you choose a wedding dress?" In the following days, Pandora followed Louise everywhere to try on wedding dresses. In the bridal shop, Louise stood before the fitting mirror, her slender waist accentuated by the pristine white gown, while Pandora hovered close behind, scrutinizing every dress and nitpicking every detail. "This neckline is too low," Pandora fussed, tugging at Louise's collar. "Find something more modest, the waistline doesn't flatter your figure enough." She picked up another dress. How could Mrs. Kaylin wear such an ordinary style? Louise remained quietly compliant throughout, like an emotionless marionette. When the final wedding dress was chosen, in the empty fitting room, Pandora finally dropped her facade. "So all this time you weren't indifferent, you were playing hard to get." She suddenly grabbed Louise's wrist, her nails digging deep into the flesh. "Let me tell you, don't think you can steal Stephen like this. He can only be mine." Louise didn't even bat an eyelid, merely withdrawing her hand calmly. There was no playing hard to get, nor any intentional snatching of Stephen. She wanted to leave more than anyone, wishing for this farce to end quickly. But what she didn't expect was that Pandora became convinced she was trying to steal Stephen and started picking fights again, on the eve of the wedding. Stephen suddenly kicked open her door. "Was it you who locked Pandora in the fitting room?" His face darkened. "Do you even know she has claustrophobia?" Louise closed her eyes wearily. "I didn't." Still lying, Stephen yanked her up violently. "Seems my previous lesson wasn't harsh enough." Ignoring her struggles, he had the bodyguards immediately lock her in the dark, damp basement. In the darkness, Louise sat huddled in a corner, hugging her knees. At midnight, she suddenly heard a rustling sound, followed by a bag of live mice being thrown in. "Ah!" She screamed and jumped up, frantically pounding on the iron door until her nails split. But no one came to save her. The next day, Stephen opened the door with a cold expression. "Just locking you up for one night. Why cry the whole time?" After a whole night of torment, Louise was already as pale as a sheet. "Pandora let the rats in." Stephen scoffed. Pandora would never do such a thing. He turned on the light. "Where are these rats you mentioned?" Louise froze. The basement was spotless, not even a single rat hair to be found. "Pandora has already cleaned up all the evidence." She opened her mouth, but in the end, said nothing. Stephen said coldly, "The wedding is in 3 days. I'll be accompanying Pandora these days and will only show up on the wedding day." He gave her a warning look. "Don't cause any more trouble, or the wedding is off." Stephen finished speaking with a cold expression before turning and leaving the basement. Louise listened as his footsteps gradually faded away before finally leaning against the wall to slowly stand up. For the next 3 days, she shut herself in her room, barely stepping outside. The meals brought by the servants, she only took a few bites. No matter how beautiful the sunlight outside the window, she never stepped out of her room. She couldn't give Pandora any more chances to frame her. Fortunately, Stephen kept his word and spent these 3 days with Pandora, not even returning home. Louise could frequently see their figures appearing together through gossip news. Pandora linked arms with Stephen, her radiant smile dazzling, while Stephen gazed down at her with eyes so tender they seemed to melt. The day before the wedding, she sat at her desk, meticulously writing down every preference and aversion of Stephen. Detests cilantro, avoids spicy food, drinks only black coffee. No sugar, insists on immaculately pressed shirts, cannot tolerate any light while sleeping. After finishing, she folded the note neatly and summoned the maid Polly. "Here, take this," she said softly. "Give it back to me after the wedding." Polly looked puzzled. "Madam, this is, in case I forget." Louise smiled faintly. "You know my memory hasn't been good lately." Polly, though finding it strange, obediently took the note. "Don't worry, madam, I'll keep it safe." After Polly left, Louise dragged out a long-packed suitcase from the depths of the wardrobe, She took one last look around the room she had lived in for 3 years, her gaze lingering for a moment on the wedding photo hanging on the wall. In the picture, Stephen stood tall and handsome in his tailored suit, godlike in his beauty, while she wore a priceless wedding dress. Smiling gently and radiantly, she carefully removed the frame, placed it face down on the table, and walked away without looking back. In the airport terminal, Mrs. Zena had been waiting for a long time. She handed Louise a bank card and a plane ticket, 30 million, not a cent less. From now on, you and the Zena family are done. Louise took the card, her fingertips trembling slightly. She looked up at her mother, only to find the woman wouldn't even spare her a glance. Thank you, she said softly. Mrs. Zena said coldly, you've done well these 3 years. Ensuring no issues arose between our two families' collaboration, she paused, then added, go now, live the life you want. Louise nodded and turned toward the security checkpoint. At the corner, she turned back for one last look. Mrs. Zena had already left, her retreating figure resolute as if she'd never had a daughter, yet she felt no sorrow. Clutching the plane ticket in her hand, her eyes grew slightly warm. This time, she could finally live for herself, without a backward glance. She walked toward the boarding gate, her figure resolute. Meanwhile, at the Kalin family's villa, a woman bearing a striking 90% resemblance to her had donned a wedding dress, quietly awaiting tomorrow's ceremony. Mona had returned. Inside the dressing room, Mona sat quietly before the mirror, letting the makeup artist trace her brows and paint her lips. The woman in the mirror had delicate features, unchanged from 3 years ago when she fled her wedding. Only her gaze now carried a colder arrogance. She gently traced the lace on her wedding dress, a faint, almost imperceptible smile curling at the corners of her lips. Outside the door, Pandora stared intently through the half-open crack at Mona's back, her nails digging deep into her palms. Just as she had suspected, Mona was never truly magnanimous. She was merely retreating to advance, trying to capture Stephen's heart. What a cunning move. What infuriated her even more was that Stephen had actually agreed to redo the wedding ceremony. Even if it was just for show, it was enough to drive her mad with jealousy. Mona, Pandora murmured under her breath, a flash of malice flickering in her eyes. You think this is enough to challenge me? Dream on. She turned and walked away, her high heels sinking soundlessly into the carpet. Moments later, Stephen pushed the door open and entered, dressed in a crisp suit. His handsome face bore traces of impatience. He glanced at Mona in the mirror and said coolly, I'll properly hold the wedding with you today, but I hope you won't make things difficult for Pandora anymore. Mona lifted her head, meeting his gaze through the mirror with eyes so calm they bordered on indifference. She didn't answer. Just softly murmured millimeter. Stephen frowned slightly. The Mona before him seemed somewhat different now, yet he couldn't quite pinpoint what exactly had changed. Just as he was about to verify further, his phone suddenly rang. Mr. Stephen, something terrible has happened. The assistant's voice was frantic. Miss Pandora is missing. Stephen's face turned pale. Without a second thought, he turned and rushed out of the dressing room. Meanwhile, in the airport waiting lounge, Louise was quietly organizing her passport. Her phone suddenly vibrated. She glanced at it, a provocative message from Pandora. Even if it were your wedding, Stephen would still abandon you for me. Tell me, who really matters more? She finished reading with an expressionless face, then took out the SM card and gave it a light snap. Click. The sound of the card breaking was crisp and resolute. She tossed the fragments into the trash, as if discarding all the endurance and pretense of the past 3 years. Meanwhile, the wedding venue was in chaos, with guests whispering and murmuring among themselves. The MC stood awkwardly on stage, unsure how to announce the delay of the ceremony. In the dressing room, Mona waited for a long time, but Stephen never returned. She stood up, about to go out and check, when the door was suddenly flung open. Stephen stood panting at the doorway, his face terrifyingly dark. His suit was disheveled, the strands of hair on his forehead damp with sweat. Clearly he had rushed back in a frantic hurry. Mona, he said hoarsely, his voice laced with suppressed anger. Pandora is in trouble. The wedding must be cancelled. Mona gazed at him quietly before suddenly smiling. Stephen, are you really willing to abandon this wedding for an outsider? Stephen froze momentarily, then replied coldly, she's not an outsider. If you hadn't targeted her before, why would she have been driven to despair? Mona shook her head, her eyes tinged with pity. You're truly pathetic. Stephen, provoked by her words, was about to lose his temper when his phone rang again. He glanced at the caller ID, his face instantly turning pale. Stephen stood at the threshold, looking at Mona in her wedding dress, forcing a sarcastic smile as his voice turned icy cold. I just told you not to mess with Pandora, and you immediately arranged to have her kidnapped. Do you really have to bully her every single moment? And now you've orchestrated this kind of drama. Mona looked up, a flicker of confusion flashing in her eyes. Just as she was about to argue, Stephen's bodyguard stepped forward. He grabbed her by the hair and roughly yanked her to the ground. Mona's knees slammed heavily onto the marble floor, the piercing pain instantly draining the color from her face. "Stephen," Mona widened her eyes in disbelief. "How dare you treat me like this?" Stephen looked down at her from his superior position, his eyes devoid of any warmth. He waved his hand and coldly ordered the bodyguards, "Drag her into the car." The bodyguard swiftly lifted Mona, ignoring her struggles, and shoved her directly into the black car parked outside. The moment the car door closed, a drug-soaked handkerchief was suddenly pressed against her mouth and nose. Mona's pupils abruptly constricted. After a few struggles, she quickly lost consciousness. After an unknowable amount of time, Mona was jolted awake by a sharp pain. She found herself stuffed inside a coarse burlap sack, her body curled up and unable to move. The next second, the sack was roughly lifted and then slammed onto the ground like discarded trash. Her arm struck the hard ground with a sharp impact, sending a piercing pain shooting through her wrist as if the bone had snapped. She groaned in pain, but with her mouth sealed by tape, only a faint whimper escaped. "One for one, hand over Pandora." Stephen's voice came from outside the burlap sack, icy and unfamiliar. "They say Mr. Stephen has a soft spot for Miss Pandora, and it seems the rumors are true." A hoarse male voice sneered. "Since you don't care for this Mrs. Kaelin, why not stab her? Let's see the sincerity of the wealthy." Stephen remained silent for a few seconds before replying coolly, "Is the money not enough?" "Money?" The kidnapper scoffed. "Mr. Stephen, we didn't take them for money." At that moment, the sound of footsteps emerged from the darkness, accompanied by a frivolous clapping sound. Tyler sauntered leisurely up to Stephen, a teasing smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Stephen, long time no see." Stephen's eyes instantly turned cold. "Tyler, I knew it was you." Tyler shrugged, his tone casual. "That flawless plan of mine was ruined by your dear wife before. Now, I'm just asking you to stab her once. Fair enough, don't you think?" "What plan?" Stephen frowned. Tyler gave a strange smile, leaned close to his ear, and whispered in a low voice, "Don't you know, I was planning to." A sudden ringtone interrupted Tyler's conversation. He glanced at the caller ID and boldly pressed the speakerphone button. "Tyler, when are you coming? We're all waiting for you." "Got it." Tyler took a step back, shaking his head with feigned regret. "As you heard, Mr. Stephen, my friend just called urging me to hang out, so you'd better decide quickly, either stab Mona or..." He paused, his grin turning vicious. "None of you are leaving." The air seemed to freeze. Stephen's gaze fell on the squirming burlap sack, a flicker of complex emotion flashing through his eyes. After a moment, he reached out to take Tyler's offered knife, his voice low. "All right." He walked up to the sack, crouched down, and lightly pressed the knife's tip against it. Mona seemed to sense the danger, struggling even more violently. But her muffled whimpers were completely stifled by the tape. Stephen's hand trembled slightly, but soon, his eyes turned cold again. The blade plunged into the sack without hesitation. Thud, blood instantly soaked through the sack's fabric. Mona's body stiffened abruptly before going limp. "Haha, excellent." Tyler laughed heartily, slapping Stephen on the shoulder. "Mr. Stephen is truly ruthless." But, his tone shifted abruptly, his gaze turning sinister. "You've bought yourself time. Now you'll pay the interest. Either stab Pandora once, or I'll stab Mona 3 more times." Stephen's face darkened instantly. "Tyler, don't push your luck." Tyler remained unmoved, leaning lazily against the wall. "Choose, Mr. Stephen. My patience is running thin." Stephen's fists clenched with a bone-cracking sound. Finally, he took a deep breath, and the blood-stained blade plunged into the sack once more. 1 stab, 2 stabs, 3 stabs. Stephen closed his eyes, his voice hoarse. "Mona. I'm sorry." After what felt like an eternity, Mona regained consciousness in the biting cold. She struggled to open her eyes, her vision blurred. The burlap sack was stifling and reeked of a nauseating metallic stench that nearly suffocated her. She gritted her teeth, mustering all her strength to break free from the sack's confines. Finally crawling out, the warehouse stood empty, leaving only her behind. Stephen was gone. Pandora had vanished too. Only she was left behind here. Mona coughed, the taste of iron rising in her throat. Her hands trembled as she fumbled in her pocket, wanting to call her parents to come take her away. Stephen was a madman. Pandora too. She truly couldn't imagine how her younger sister had managed all these years. But just as she pulled out her phone, a figure rushed from the shadows and slapped her hard across the face. Smack! The phone went flying and smashed violently against the wall. Mona was struck so hard her head snapped to the side, a trickle of blood seeping from the corner of her mouth. She slowly raised her eyes to see Pandora standing before her, wearing a triumphant sneer. "Who else are you planning to call and play the victim for?" Pandora looked down at her with contempt. Her tone dripping with sarcasm, Mona remained silent, only gradually propping herself up against the wall as she gasped for breath. Pandora grew even more arrogant when she saw her silence. She walked over, reached out to grip Mona's chin, forcing her to look up. "Cat got your tongue, see, I told you. Even if it's your wedding, just one message from me, and Stephen would come running." She leaned closer to Mona's ear, lowering her voice, enunciating each word. "If you have any self-awareness left, you'd better leave quietly and give up the title of Mrs. Kaylin." Mona stared at her, then suddenly smiled. Pandora froze, not yet comprehending, when Mona used the hand gripping her chin to shove her away with brutal force. Pandora was caught off guard, her entire body slamming into the metal shelves behind her. The sharp edges struck her lower back with a heavy thud, the pain instantly curling her into a fetal position as her face drained of color. You dare push me?" She stared at Mona in disbelief, her voice trembling. Mona leaned against the wall, slowly rising to her feet, drenched in blood. Her face was as pale as paper. "Push you?" She let out a light laugh, dragging her injured leg as she stepped toward Pandora. "I did push you, so what?" Pandora panicked, scrambling backward on all fours. "Why you stay away from me?" Mona ignored her, bending down to pick up a section of steel pipe from the ground, weighing it in her hand. Pandora's pupils constricted abruptly. This Mona before her seemed different from the person who had meekly endured her bullying before. "Help!" she screamed, trying to crawl away, but Mona grabbed her ankle and yanked her back violently. "Weren't you acting all high and mighty just now?" Mona looked down at her, tapping the steel pipe lightly against her face. "Scared now, aren't you?" Pandora trembled all over, her face smeared with tears and snot, yet she still put on a brave front. "If you dare lay a hand on me, Stephen won't let you get away with it." Mona sneered and swung the steel pipe down hard on her leg. Pandora's scream echoed through the warehouse. Mona turned a deaf ear, continuing to strike her blow after blow with ruthless efficiency. Those years abroad had long since stripped away any weakness that might have made her easy prey. Pandora was beaten to within an inch of her life, too weak even to beg for mercy. Curled up on the ground, Mona panted, wiped the blood from her face, and prepared for the final strike. Bang! The warehouse door was suddenly kicked open, blinding light poured in. Stephen stood at the entrance, glaring at them with a dark expression. Pandora's eyes instantly sparkled with hope the moment she saw Stephen appear. Dragging her battered and bruised body, she limped toward him, tears streaming down her face as her voice trembled uncontrollably. "Stephen, she's trying to kill me." Mona's gone mad. "She can't stand to see me happy." Stephen pulled her into his arms, his gaze darkening as he glared at Mona, his voice seething with suppressed rage. "What the hell is this?" Mona wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand, let out a cold laugh, and casually tossed the steel pipe in her hand aside. A sharp clang rang out as metal hit the ground, the sound piercing through the empty warehouse. "Stephen," she said hoarsely, yet with eerie calmness. "You'd better think carefully about who was really at fault today." She paused, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Don't forget, you still owe me from today." Stephen frowned, his tone icy. "Wasn't it you who colluded with Tyler?" "Ha!" Mona let out a short laugh, her eyes glinting coldly. "Fine then, I'll go tell the media right now." She stared straight into Stephen's eyes, enunciating each word clearly. "I just wonder if you can handle the backlash. If I recall correctly, the Kaylin family has been trying to purchase that plot of land in the East District recently." Then she turned to Pandora. "Miss Pandora, I suppose you wouldn't want to be labeled as the other woman online tomorrow either." Pandora turned pale, her lips trembling as she immediately clung weakly to Stephen's chest, sobbing. "Stephen, it's all my fault. It must be because the wedding wasn't completed that Miss Mona is upset." Stephen furrowed his brows even deeper as he looked at Mona. "If it's because of this, I can compensate you. Why must you make things difficult for Pandora?" Mona let out a mocking laugh, her eyes filled with scorn. "Don't waste your effort." She slowly straightened up, battered yet unbowed, her back ramrod straight. "Who cares about your wedding? Even without this ceremony, I'll still be Mrs. Kaylin." With that, Mona no longer looked at them. Clutching her abdominal wound, she walked step by step toward the warehouse exit. As she passed by Stephen and Pandora, her footsteps hesitated slightly, her voice icy. "Let's leave it at that for today. No need to rush. We have plenty of time ahead of us." With that, she left without looking back. Stephen stood rooted to the spot, watching her retreating figure, when an unfamiliar emotion suddenly pierced his heart like a dagger. She was clearly covered in dirt, clearly stabbed by his own hand, clearly should have been furious, should have been hysterical. Yet she merely glanced at him calmly, and it made his chest tighten. Stephen suddenly realized that he might have never truly seen her for who she was. The Pandora in his arms was still sobbing quietly, yet he inexplicably felt irritated, He instinctively raised his hand to wipe the tears from her face. But the moment his fingertips touched her skin, the image of Mona smiling coldly with blood at the corner of her lips flashed through his mind. His movements froze. A secret, unprecedented emotion began to grow in his heart. Did she become like this because of Pandora? Was it because of him? This thought made Stephen hold his breath. Pandora sat on the villa's sofa as the family doctor carefully tended to the bruises on her body. When the alcohol swab touched the wound, she gasped in pain, but her mind was completely occupied by that icy glare Mona had given her in the warehouse earlier. Something's wrong. This is seriously off. It's the same face, yet that gaze, that ruthless intensity, utterly unrecognizable from the formerly submissive Mona, TSK. She suddenly clenched the armrest, making the doctor hastily apologize. Miss Pandora, bear with it, it'll be over soon. Pandora waved impatiently. Signaling him to hurry up after the doctor left, she stood up and decided to pour herself a glass of water to calm down. Just as she reached the hallway, she overheard two maids whispering in the corner, clutching an envelope. Madam instructed us to give it to her after the wedding. But now the ceremony isn't finished. What should we do? Sure. Keep your voice down. If Mr. Stephen finds out we didn't handle Madam's request properly. Pandora narrowed her eyes and approached silently. What are you talking about? The two maids were startled, one nearly dropping the envelope in her hand. Seeing it was Pandora, their faces turned even paler. Miss Pandora, what is this? Pandora reached out directly. Let me see. The maid hesitated but finally handed it over. Madam gave this to us earlier, saying to pass it back to her after the wedding. But now that the ceremony wasn't completed, we didn't know what to do. Pandora felt a stir in her heart but maintained a gentle smile. Is that so? Then leave it to me. I was just about to look for her. Once the maid had left, she immediately returned to her room, locked the door behind her, and eagerly tore open the envelope. Inside were several handwritten notes. The characters neat and legible. Stephen is allergic to milk. Be sure to avoid it. He hated sweets, drinking only black coffee without sugar. There's stomach medicine in the second drawer on the left side of the study. He forgets to take it when working overtime. Pandora's fingers trembled slightly. Mona already knew Stephen well enough. Why did she still need to write these things down, still needing to commission a servant to deliver it to oneself? Unless... Pandora's heart suddenly began racing wildly. Unless the person currently in the villa wasn't Mona at all. She abruptly stood up, grabbed her phone, and dialed a number. Investigate Mona for me. The more details, the better, especially all her movements over the past 3 months. After hanging up the phone, she tucked the letter into the bottom layer of her jewelry box and took a deep breath to calm herself. Just as she opened the door, she ran straight into Mona, who was coming up the stairs. Their eyes met, and the air instantly froze. Pandora suppressed her pounding heart and forced a smile. Miss Mona, Stephen is in the study. Would you like to bring him a cup of warm milk? She stared intently at Mona's face, not missing the slightest change in expression. Mona slowly raised an eyebrow, her gaze shifting from the swollen face to the milk cup in her hand, then suddenly let out a cold laugh as she took the cup. Splash! A full cup of hot milk was directly splashed onto Pandora's face. Ah! Pandora screamed as she stumbled backward, milk dripping down her hair in a pitiful mess. Have you lost your mind? Mona slammed the empty glass onto the ground, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. She curled her lips into a sneer, her eyes filled with contempt. Servants handle such trivial matters. Who do you think you are, daring to order me around? Pandora trembled with rage. You, how dare you? What's going on? Stephen emerged from the study at the sound, frowning at the scene. Mona crossed her arms, her expression defiant. I did it. Got a problem with that? She shot a glance at Pandora. At least I own up to my actions, unlike some people who specialize in underhanded tricks. With that, she turned and walked away, her high heels mercilessly crunching over the shattered glass on the floor, producing a piercing screech. Pandora tearfully looked at Stephen. Stephen, why is she treating me like this? Stephen remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on Mona's retreating figure, then unexpectedly said, the wedding wasn't completed. It's normal for her to be upset. He averted his eyes. It's not a big deal. Go wash up yourself. Pandora stood thunderstruck, staring at him in disbelief. Is he actually speaking up for that woman? Pandora followed Stephen all the way into the study, her voice still choked with sobs. Stephen, if Mona really hates me this much, I should never have come back. Stephen rubbed his temples, his tone still gentle. Don't overthink it. She's probably just in a bad mood. Why is she in a bad mood? Is it because of me? Pandora's tears fell like broken strings of pearls. I know, I shouldn't have come between you two in the first place. Stephen poured a glass of whiskey and remained silent. Pandora, seeing this, cried even harder. Don't you love me anymore? No one in this world has ever truly loved me. If even you abandon me, what's the point of me living? No sooner had the words left her mouth than she abruptly stood and bolted toward the floor-to-ceiling window. Stephen reacted with lightning reflexes, grabbing her wrist in a firm grip as the expensive whiskey splashed across the floor. "Stop this." His voice carried suppressed fury. Pandora collapsed into his arms, sobbing. "Then can't you just, like before?" She lifted her swollen, red-rimmed eyes. "At least punish her. The way she treated me today, it really hurt." Stephen remained silent for a moment before finally nodding, just as the two reached Mona's door. The villa's doorbell suddenly rang sharply. The butler hurried over, his face unusually pale. "Mr. Stephen, there are police outside." Before he could finish speaking, 3 uniformed officers had already entered. Mona stood in the hallway at some point, wearing a silk nightgown, her long hair loosely cascading with a soft sheen under the light. "I was the one who called the police." Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Stephen turned pale instantly. Mona slowly rolled up her sleeve, revealing shocking bruises on her arm. "I'm filing charges against Pandora for intentional assault." She looked at the police officer. "The evidence is right here." "Are you insane?" Stephen grabbed her wrist. "She was just joking with you." "A joke?" Mona let out a cold laugh and abruptly pulled her hand back. "Mr. Stephen has a very peculiar definition of a joke." Pandora turned pale and hurriedly defended herself. "I didn't mean to, I just..." "Then apologize." Mona cut her off. "Or we'll take legal action." Under the policeman's gaze, Pandora could only bite her lip and lower her head in humiliation. Sorry." After the police left, Mona slammed the door shut without looking back. Stephen stood frozen, his brow furrowed. Was it his imagination? Mona had become so unfamiliar. Late at night, Stephen still knocked on Mona's door. Mona leaned against the doorframe, her robe slightly open at the collar, revealing delicate collarbones. Holding a glass of red wine, she lazily asked, "What is it?" Stephen gazed at her for a moment. "What's been going on with you lately?" He softened his tone. "Pandora is only staying temporarily. You're already Mrs. Kaelin. What more could you possibly be dissatisfied with?" "Stephen." Mona suddenly cut him off, her red lips curling into a mocking smile as she took a sip of red wine. "Being with me while letting her move in. Do you get a kick out of toying with me?" "That's not what I meant." Stephen frowned, but with a loud bang, the door was slammed shut in his face. Stephen stood outside the door, his expression shifting between gloom and uncertainty. Before him, Mona was a completely different person from before. When had that once obedient woman become so difficult to control? Crash! On the other side, the priceless vase was smashed violently onto the floor, shards scattering everywhere. Pandora trembled with rage, sweeping all the bottles and jars off her dressing table. "Mona," she ground out the name through clenched teeth, her eyes dark and venomous. "We'll see about this." Pandora woke up close to noon. She had tossed and turned all night, her mind filled with Stephen's strange behavior and Mona's icy stare. She rubbed her temples and decided to fill her stomach first before figuring things out. However, when she entered the dining room, she found only one breakfast set on the table. Mona was leisurely eating toast with a cup of black coffee by her hand. "Where's my breakfast?" Pandora asked with a frown. Mona didn't even look up, finishing the last bite of her toast before lazily glancing at her. "If you want some, go ask the housekeeper to make it." She wiped the corner of her mouth. "I made this myself. There's only one portion." Pandora felt a tightness in her chest, suppressing her anger as she said, "Then have the housekeeper make some now." Mona let out a light laugh, stood up, and walked straight past her without so much as an extra glance. Pandora clenched her fists in anger, turned and rushed into the kitchen, only to find it empty except for a young maid clearing the dishes. "Where's the cook?" she demanded. The maid was startled by her tone and answered cautiously, "The cook took the day off and went home today." "Then why does Mona get to eat?" Madam did it herself." The maid lowered her head, her voice growing fainter. Pandora turned pale with rage and slammed the door shut as she left. She returned to her bedroom on an empty stomach, too angry to even drink water. Just then, her phone suddenly rang. It was the private detective. She immediately answered the phone. The voice on the other end hushed. "Miss Pandora, I've uncovered something." "Speak," she commanded impatiently. The night before the wedding, surveillance footage captured someone identical to Mona leaving the Kaelin family's villa. The private investigator paused. "Additionally, I found that 3 years ago, the Zena family had made a deal with the previous Mona. The specifics are unclear, but it appears to be related to a marriage substitution." Pandora's pupils constricted, her fingers tightening involuntarily. "Do you have proof? Do you want to come get the copies of the photos and transaction records now?" "Send me the address, I'll be right there." After hanging up, Pandora quickly changed clothes, put on sunglasses and a hat, and quietly left the villa. Half an hour later, She met the private detective at a remote cafe. They handed her a craft paper bag and whispered, "All the documents are inside, including surveillance screenshots and the financial transaction records of the Zenner family." Pandora couldn't wait to open it. After flipping through a few pages, a cold smile curled at the corner of her lips. "Just as I thought, the current Mona has been replaced." After paying the remaining balance, she stuffed the documents into her bag and walked back in high spirits. Now, she was going to see how much longer that imposter could keep up her arrogance. However, as soon as she returned to the villa's entrance, she ran into Mona, who was just about to leave. The two locked eyes, and this time, Pandora didn't bother hiding her disdain. She raised her chin provocatively and said, "Mona, oh wait, should I call you by another name?" Mona paused in her steps and stared coldly at her. Pandora shook the document folder in her hand with a triumphant smile. "I already know your secret. If you don't want to be kicked out by Steven, you'd better kneel and apologize to me now." Mona stared at her expressionlessly for a few seconds before suddenly letting out a light laugh. "Psycho." With that, she turned to leave. Pandora, thoroughly enraged by her attitude, rushed forward and grabbed her wrist. "Who do you think you're fooling? I'm telling you, this evidence is enough to..." Before she could finish speaking, Mona violently jerked her hand away. Pandora, caught off guard, slipped and fell backward. In her panic, she desperately grabbed Mona's clothing, and the two tumbled down the stairs together. The sound of bodies hitting the steps mingled with Pandora's screams until they both crashed heavily onto the first-floor ground. The photos and documents in the file folder were also scattered all over the ground. Steven turned pale upon receiving the news and immediately rushed to the hospital with his assistant. In the corridor, his footsteps were hurried and heavy, his mind flashing back to Mona's recent odd behavior, her gaze, her attitude, even her coldness and hostility toward him and Pandora. Two hospital rooms stood side by side, and Steven stood between them, momentarily unsure which door to push open first. Just as he hesitated, a nurse walked over holding a document folder. "Mr. Steven, these are items that fell from Miss Pandora. Please verify them." Steven took the folder and casually opened it, his pupils suddenly constricting. Inside were several surveillance screenshots and transaction records, clearly showing that on the night before the wedding, a woman identical to Mona left the Kalin family villa. What shocked him even more was that 3 years ago, the Zenner family had engaged in a secret transaction with Mona, noted as compensation for a substitute marriage. Fake. His voice was hoarse, his fingers tightening unconsciously, crumpling the document folder in his palm. All the inconsistencies suddenly connected in that moment. It turned out she wasn't Mona at all. Steven jerked his head up, eyes blazing with fury, and turned to confront the Mona in the hospital room for answers. Yet the moment he took a step forward, he saw Pandora standing at the corridor's corner, her face pale as she stared fixedly at the document folder in his hand. "Steven," she hurried forward, her voice deliberately trembling. "I always suspected something was off about her. She's not Mona at all. She's an imposter." Steven gazed coldly at her, not missing the flicker of panic in her eyes. Suppressing his doubts, he asked in a low voice, "Why are you investigating these things?" Pandora stiffened, then forced a pale smile. I was just worried you might be deceived." Steven ignored her and pushed open Mona's hospital room door, only to find it empty. The nurse told him that the Zenner family had taken Madam away not long ago. Zenner family. Steven's eyes darkened as he immediately ordered his assistant, "Verify the authenticity of these documents and prepare the car. I'm going to the Zenner residence." Pandora quickly stepped forward to stop him, her voice urgent. "Steven, if she ran away, it proves she's guilty. She impersonated Mona. Maybe it was all for the Kalin family's fortune. Why chase after her?" Steven paused mid-step and turned to look at her. "I just want to know where the real Mona is." Pandora stiffened, her smile barely holding. "Steven, do you have feelings for her?" Steven didn't answer, only gave her a deep look before striding away. Pandora stood rooted to the spot, fingers clutching the hem of her clothes, torn between regret and unease. She had thought exposing Mona would secure Steven for herself, never expecting things to come to this. Gazing at the Pandora beside him, Steven felt his doubts grow heavier by the moment. Pandora was also behaving unusually. He pondered for a moment before sending a message to his assistant. "Also look into Pandora and find out why she's investigating these matters." After getting into the car, Steven frowned slightly, feeling like something was missing. The car was unnervingly quiet, and something was missing. He furrowed his brows in thought. The familiar jasmine scent that could slightly ease his tense nerves was gone. Why was the car fragrance changed? He asked the driver coldly. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror and answered cautiously, "Mr. Steven, the previous blend was personally prepared by Madam. She said it could soothe the mind, But recently, Madam hasn't provided any new ones. Stephen startled, as several images suddenly flashed through his mind. Returning late from overtime work, Mona would always leave a light on in the entryway and a cup of warm honey water on the table. When he had a stomachache, she would deliberately add a bit of yam to the kanji she made, soft and glutinous without being overly sweet. On rainy days, she would quietly slip a small sachet of jasmine fragrance into his suit pocket, saying it could dispel the damp chill. Those tiny, almost overlooked moments of tenderness now pierced his heart like a silent needle. Zena family inside the villa, the atmosphere was unbearably tense. Mona pointed at her injuries and said through gritted teeth, "That idiot living as me had such a miserable life, utterly useless. This is nothing short of an insult to me, Mrs." Zena hugged her tenderly. "Don't be angry, sweetheart, we'll get revenge for you." "Revenge?" Mona scoffed coldly. "Our family is nothing like before now, and we've already given her 30 million. How can we possibly fight against the Kalin family?" Hearing this, Mr. and Mrs. Zena turned pale. Mona was right. The Zena family had long been on the decline. Even if it didn't look so bad on the surface, against the Kalin family, they could only tough it out. Just then, the butler announced that Stephen and Pandora had arrived together. Mr. and Mrs. Zena exchanged a glance before storming out, their gazes instantly locking onto Pandora. "Is this the bitch who bullied my daughter?" Mrs. Zena shrieked, pointing at Pandora and cursing. "How dare you bring her here to show off? Do you really think the Zena family has no one left to stand up for us?" He was about to step forward and take action. Stephen raised his hand to stop him, his tone icy. "I'm here today because I have questions to ask." Mr. Zena snorted coldly, but due to the influence of the Kalin family, he still stepped aside to make way. "Come in and talk." Inside the study, the atmosphere was heavy. Stephen got straight to the point. "Where is the real Mona?" The Zenas paled visibly. After exchanging glances, Mr. Zena forced composure and said, "Stephen, what do you mean by that? The one living with the Kalins is our daughter Mona." "Is that so?" Stephen sneered, pulling a document from his suit pocket and slapping it onto the table. "Did you think the bride swap 3 years ago could stay hidden forever?" Mrs. Zena's fingers trembled slightly as she began to protest, when suddenly the study door was pushed open. "I am Mona, what's the matter?" A cold voice rang out. Stephen turned his head and saw Mona standing at the door, holding up an ID card with the name Mona clearly written on it. Stephen stared at the document, his brow furrowed. The person in the photo was identical to the face before him, yet his intuition told him things were far from this simple. "If Mr. Stephen doubts my identity, he's welcome to investigate," she said coolly, turning to leave. Stephen grabbed her wrist, his voice low. "Who the hell are you?" She looked up at him, her gaze calm to the point of indifference. "Does it matter, after all? There's never been a place for Mona in Mr. Stephen's heart." The words struck Stephen like a knife to the chest. His grip loosened instinctively as she walked away without looking back. That evening, the assistant's call came through. "Mr. Stephen, we've confirmed everything." The assistant's voice carried a hint of tension. "The Zena family indeed has 2 daughters, twins. The one who married into your family 3 years ago was actually the younger sister, Louise. Because the elder sister, Mona, fled the wedding and went abroad, the Zena family had the younger sister take her place. But for some reason, the elder sister has recently returned." Stephen gripped his phone tightly, his knuckles turning white. "So that's how it is. The one who had cooked kanji for him, left the light on for him, and silently endured everything, had never been Mona. It was Louise." He suddenly stood up, his eyes icy cold. "Take people to Zena's house immediately and invite the Zena couple over." The Zena couple were pressed into chairs by bodyguards, their faces deathly pale. Stephen stood before them, his gaze as cold as ice. "Where is Louise?" he asked through gritted teeth, enunciating each word deliberately. Mrs. Zena's lips trembled as she forced out the words. "That wretched girl took the money and left. 30 million, not a penny less. She's been cunning since childhood. And now that her wings have hardened, she doesn't even respect her own parents." "Enough." Stephen slammed the table so hard the entire room seemed to shake. "How my wife behaves is none of your concern." Just then, his assistant hurried in and handed a stack of documents to Stephen. "Mr. Stephen, we've found it." Stephen flipped through the documents, his expression darkening with each page he read. Louise had been abandoned in the countryside since birth. For over 20 years, her parents never visited her once, not even providing living expenses. She survived solely on her grandparents' meager savings. At the age of 5, Louise fell ill with a high fever of 40 degrees. Her grandmother desperately called for help overnight, but Mrs. Zena simply hung up. The doctor said another 10 minutes delay could have been catastrophic. Mona gets a lavish birthday party every year, while Louise doesn't even have a decent cotton-padded coat. Good, very good. Stephen's voice was chillingly dangerous as he flung the documents violently at the faces of the Zena couple. How could parents like you even exist in this world, Mr. Zena? His face stinging from the paper cuts, still tried to justify himself. We brought her into this world and raised her this big. Isn't that enough? Raise her. Stephen grabbed Mr. Zena by the collar. Every piece of clothing she wore before 18 was hand-me-downs from neighbors. What did you treat her as? A tool for a substitute marriage? He abruptly released his grip and barked at the bodyguards. Lock them in the basement and give them special care. They'll be released when they're ready to tell the truth. Stephen, how dare you, Mrs. Zena shrieked. We're Louise's parents. Stephen sneered. Now you remember you're her parents. The bodyguards were roughly dragging the two away when the study door suddenly burst open. Mona rushed in, her face deathly pale. Stephen, are you insane? Let my parents go. Stephen looked at her coldly. So you finally stopped pretending. Mona froze, then screamed hysterically. Yes, I'm Mona, so what? That bitch never should have married you. She's just some country bumpkin. How dare she? Slap. A resounding slap landed hard across her face. Mona staggered backward several steps, clutching her cheek in disbelief. This slap is for your sister, Stephen said with venom in his eyes. You Zena family members are each more disgusting than the last. Mona suddenly burst into hysterical laughter. Ha ha ha, Stephen, how dare you pretend to be devoted now? How did you treat her these past 3 years? Making her sleep in the guest room, bringing other women home, even throwing her into the frozen lake for Pandora. She narrowed her eyes venomously. Stephen, stop pretending. Do you think you really loved my sister? You didn't even notice when she left. You never understood her at all. Stephen felt his breath catch, as if his chest had been struck by a sledgehammer. Where is she? His voice was terrifyingly hoarse. Mona wiped the blood from her lips and smiled. You'll never find her. Stephen suddenly grabbed her by the throat, only to lose all strength when he saw her face turning purple. It was a face identical to Louise's. Get out. He turned away, his voice weary and icy. Don't let me see you again. Mona collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, yet still laughing. You deserve this, Stephen. Stephen didn't turn around. His phone suddenly vibrated. It was a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Stephen, we've found a lead. Miss Mona purchased a ticket to City N 2 weeks ago. Stephen's pupils constricted abruptly. Book me the earliest flight available immediately. Meanwhile, Louise stood by the seaside, the salty ocean breeze brushing against her cheeks as her hair lifted gently in the wind. In the distance, the setting sun dyed the sea surface orange-red, while waves rolled onto the beach in layers before slowly retreating. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and savored the long-lost tranquility. Miss Louise, a gentle male voice came from behind. Louise turned around and saw a tall, slender man standing not far away. Holding a bag of fresh seafood in his hand, he was dressed in a simple white shirt and casual pants, with handsome features and a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. I'm Sean, living next door to you. He took a few steps closer, his voice warm and smooth. Heard you moved in today, so I brought some seafood as a neighborly welcome gift. Louise paused briefly, then smiled politely. Thank you, but that's really not necessary. Don't be polite. Sean handed over the bag with natural ease. City NS seafood is the freshest. Since you're new here, you should try the local flavors. His demeanor was neither overly warm nor distant, just the right amount of friendliness that made it impossible to refuse. Louise hesitated for a moment before accepting it. Well, thank you, Sean smiled, his gaze falling on the luggage behind her. Need any help? No need, I've already packed most of it. Alright, just call me if you need anything. He nodded and turned to leave, his figure straight yet casual. Louise watched his retreating figure, slightly lost in thought. He was the first person to initiate a conversation with her since she arrived in City N. In the days that followed, Louise gradually adapted to life in the small town. She opened a small flower shop by the sea, trimming stems and wrapping bouquets, her days peaceful and fulfilling. Occasionally, she would sit at the shop's entrance, gazing at the distant ocean. Her thoughts drifting far away before returning, Sean would occasionally come to buy flowers, sometimes a bunch of sunflowers, other times a few stems of lisianthus. He never made deliberate conversation, simply offering a brief greeting, paying, and leaving, until one evening, a sudden rainstorm arrived. Louise was about to close the shop when the raindrops began pattering down. Standing under the eaves, she watched the rain grow heavier, a slight frown creasing her brow. No umbrella. A familiar voice came from behind. She turned around and saw Sean standing in the curtain of rain, holding a black long-handled umbrella. I'll walk you back, he said. Louise initially wanted to refuse, but the rain was too heavy. In the end, she could only nod in agreement. Thank you. The two walked side by side in the rain. The umbrella wasn't particularly large. Sean, yet he deliberately tilted it toward her, leaving his own shoulder damp with rain. Louise noticed and leaned slightly closer to him. You don't have to, it's fine, he smiled, just a little rain. The rain pattered softly as neither spoke another word. When they reached her doorstep, Louise hesitated for a moment before speaking up. Would you like to come in for a cup of hot tea? Sean glanced at her and nodded. Sure. After that night, the relationship between the two seemed to grow closer. Sean would occasionally come to the flower shop to help move heavy items. Louise would also bring him dinner when he worked overtime. He never asked about her past, and she never brought it up, until one day, Louise accidentally pricked her finger on a rose thorn while arranging flowers. As the blood welled up, her movements froze. She remembered that day, after being abandoned in the frozen lake. Stephen's icy gaze, fingers trembling slightly. What's wrong? Sean's voice suddenly sounded. She snapped out of it and shook her head. It's nothing, just a scratch. Sean frowned, immediately grabbing her hand for closer inspection. The cut's a bit deep, needs disinfecting. His palm was warm and dry, his movements gentle yet unyielding. Louise stared at him blankly, suddenly feeling her eyes grow hot. An indescribable ache welled up in her heart. It had been so long since anyone had cared for her like this. The two pressed close together, each feeling something different stirring in their hearts. As night fell, the bonfire was lit, and the crowd danced and sang on the beach, laughter mingling with the sound of the waves. Louise sat on the sand, quietly watching the lively crowd. Not joining the fun, Sean sat down beside her, handing her a cup of hot cocoa. She took it and smiled. I prefer watching. Sean said nothing. Sitting with her in silence, after a long while, he suddenly spoke. Louise, She turned her face to him questioningly. You deserve better. He turned to look at her, his gaze earnest. Don't let the past hold you back. Louise froze. The sea breeze brushed past, the glow of the bonfire illuminating his profile. Gentle yet resolute, she lowered her head and softly murmured, millimeter. Perhaps she could really try to move forward. Stephen stood on the streets of City N, where the sea breeze carried a briny dampness that washed over his face. He gazed at the unfamiliar yet bustling city before him, his eyes gloomy and weary. For a month, he had practically combed through City N from corner to corner, yet he still hadn't found a trace of Louise. The clue from the assistant only mentioned she bought a ticket to City N, but this city is so vast. Where exactly is she hiding? Stephen rubbed his temples, his bloodshot eyes betraying days of relentless travel. He glanced at his wristwatch. It was already 9 p.m., and the streets were gradually emptying. He walked aimlessly, his gaze sweeping over every passing figure, afraid of missing even the slightest possibility. Suddenly, his footsteps came to an abrupt halt. Not far ahead, a woman in a white dress stood with her back to him under the streetlight. The slender figure, the slightly lifted strands of hair, every detail resembled Louise. Stephen's heart suddenly tightened. His blood seeming to boil in an instant, almost instinctively, he rushed forward, grabbing the woman's wrist, his voice hoarse and urgent. Louise. The woman was startled and turned her head abruptly, revealing an unfamiliar face. Who are you? The woman panicked, shaking off his hand and stepping back 2 paces. Stephen stood frozen in place, the light in his eyes instantly extinguished. It wasn't her. Stephen gazed at the vast sea of people and suddenly laughed. The laughter was hoarse and bitter. He pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant's number. Keep searching. Turn City N upside down if you have to. But find her. Hanging up, he raised his eyes to the night sky, his gaze stubborn and frenzied. Louise, where on earth are you? The morning sunlight filtered through the white gauze curtains. Louise pushed open the window as the damp sea breeze, carrying a faint salty tang, rushed to greet her. She took a deep breath, the corners of her lips lifting slightly. This guesthouse was purchased with part of that sum, a 3-story building facing the sea, its courtyard filled with roses and lisianthus she had planted herself. Every morning, she would cut a few fresh blooms to arrange in each room of the guesthouse. Louise, breakfast smells amazing today. Several student guests who came for summer vacation waved at her cheerfully from downstairs. Louise smiled with crinkled eyes. Glad you like it. There's more in the kitchen if you want seconds. As she turned to go downstairs, she spotted Sean walking into the yard carrying a bag of fresh fish. Just caught at the docks this morning. I'll make you fish soup for lunch, he said, shaking the bag gently with a warm smile. Louise took it, her fingertips accidentally brushing against his palm, the warmth traveling from her fingers straight to her heart. Both froze for a moment, then simultaneously averted their gaze with unspoken understanding. Over these past few months, Sean had become the most familiar person in her life. He was like a beam of light shining into her dim world. In the past, Louise had always lived in the shadow of others, devoid of independent thought, drifting through life in a daze. It was his presence that made her realize she too could be cared for. that she also had the right to do whatever she desired. By the way, didn't you recently say you were craving crème brûlée while watching videos? Louise pulled out an entire box of creamy custard topped with a thin caramelized sugar crust from the freezer, something she had specially prepared early that morning. Sean's eyes shone with undisguised delight. I just knew you'd make it for me. He eagerly scooped a spoonful, the rich, velvety sweetness melting on his tongue the moment it entered his mouth. He, who never had a sweet tooth, ate 3 in a row without feeling the slightest bit sick of them. Even better than what 5-star hotels make, Sean praised sincerely. Then I'll make them for you often from now on. Louise smiled, her eyes crinkling with joy. Sean nodded, his gaze lingering on her face as if he wanted to say something but hesitated. What's wrong? She asked. He paused, then simply shook his head. Nothing, I just think, you look really good now, much better than when you first came to City N, always staring at the sea in a daze. Louise was momentarily taken aback. Then smiled lightly. Yes, this place suits me well. The evening brought an unexpected downpour. Louise was brewing coffee in the kitchen when thunder roared outside, raindrops pelting against the window panes. She had just shut the window when rapid knocking sounded at the door. Who is it? She pulled the door open to find Sean standing soaked on the doorstep, clutching something tightly to his chest. Come in quickly. She immediately stepped aside to let him enter. Sean hurried in, carefully opening his coat. A thin white kitten curled up in his arms, shivering, saw it at the alley entrance, almost got washed away by the water. He said in a low voice, tinged with heartache. Louise immediately brought a towel and gently wrapped the kitten. Let's dry it first, I'll go get the hairdryer. She turned to leave, but her wrist was Sean grabbed in an instant. Your hair's wet too, he frowned, brushing the rainwater off her shoulder. The two stood extremely close. Louise could catch the faint scent of rain on him, mingled with a crisp hint of pine. Her heart skipped a beat as she instinctively took half a step back. Sean withdrew his hand and cleared his throat softly. Let's tend to the cat first. Millimeter. She lowered her head, the tips of her ears growing warm. Louise sat on the living room carpet, gently stroking the kitten's head. It had already fallen asleep, its tiny body rising and falling with each breath. Sean walked over carrying 2 cups of warm milk and handed her one. Not sleeping yet, just keeping it company a little longer. She took the milk, her fingertips warmed by its heat. Sean sat down beside her, remained silent for a moment, then suddenly spoke. Louise, what's wrong? If one day, he paused, his voice very soft, you wanted to start a new relationship, what kind of person would you consider? Louise was startled and turned to look at him. Moonlight streamed through the window, falling on Sean's profile. He wore a perpetual smile, his eyes brimming with undisguised, intense affection. Her heartbeat suddenly quickened, a faint blush spreading across her cheeks as she hastily averted her gaze. I hadn't thought about it. Sean smiled and didn't press further. The two sat quietly, with only the faint purring of the kitten echoing through the room. Louise crouched in the corner of the courtyard, holding a small piece of fish in her hand, carefully feeding it to the tiny white kitten. The kitten ate happily, occasionally rubbing its head against her fingers and purring contentedly. She couldn't help but chuckle softly, lightly tapping the tip of its nose with her finger. Sean, does it look a bit chubbier to you? She asked without turning her head. Thinking it was Sean who had arrived, there was no response from behind, only the rustling of wind through leaves. Louise frowned slightly and was about to turn her head when suddenly someone grabbed her from behind in a tight embrace. The familiar scent instantly enveloped her, a mix of crisp cedarwood with a faint hint of tobacco. It was Stephen's signature fragrance. Her body stiffened abruptly. I've finally found you, Stephen's voice murmured by her ear, low and hoarse. Trembling with unconcealed emotion, his arms tightly encircled her waist, as if afraid she might vanish the next second. Louise caught her breath, then composed herself, her voice icy. Let go. Stephen not only didn't release her but held her even tighter, as if trying to press her into his very bones. Louise, do you have any idea how long I've searched for you? I scoured all of City N, even sent people abroad. How could you just disappear like that, Stephen? She addressed him by his full name, her tone devoid of any emotion. Let me go. I won't let go. His voice suddenly rose, tinged with uncontrolled anger. What gives you the right to leave? How dare you just walk away without a word? Do you even know what I... Before he could finish, a figure suddenly charged from the side, landing a fierce punch on Stephen's face. Stephen staggered back, caught off guard, a trickle of blood seeping from the corner of his mouth. Stay away from her. Sean stepped in front of Louise, his gaze sharp as a blade, his voice laced with unmistakable warning. Touch her again, and I'll call the police right now. Stephen wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth with a grim expression, his dark gaze shifting from Sean before settling on Louise. Her expression remained calm, as if everything that had just happened had nothing to do with her. So that's how it is. Stephen let out a cold laugh, his eyes swirling with complex emotions. You left me because of him. Louise stood up, brushing off non-existent dust from her skirt, her tone indifferent. Stephen, do you think too highly of yourself? I left you, never because of anyone else. Stephen's pupils constricted violently, his chest as if struck by a sledgehammer, making it hard to breathe. Then why did you leave? Between us, there was never anything between us. Louise cut him off, finally lifting her gaze to meet his, her eyes cold as ice. Stephen, have you forgotten? These 3 years I stayed by your side were only for money and freedom. Now the deal is over, we're even, settled. Stephen's voice was practically grinding his teeth. Louise, do you really think we can be settled, or what? She let out a light laugh, her eyes devoid of any warmth. Did you think I loved you? Stephen's face instantly paled, as if he had been stabbed hard. He opened his mouth, only to find he had nothing to say. Indeed, she had never said she loved him, even when he hurt her time and again. She simply endured in silence, never showing the slightest hint of concern, yet he foolishly believed her gentleness and patience were born of love. Louise, let's go. Sean wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his tone tender but his eyes warily fixed on Stephen. Louise nodded and turned to leave. Wait. Stephen suddenly reached out to grab her wrist, but was forcefully blocked by Sean. Stephen, please behave yourself. Sean's voice was cold as ice. Stephen's gaze turned terrifyingly sinister, his fists clenched audibly. Who the hell do you think you are? How dare you meddle in our affairs? Our affairs? Louise finally turned back, her eyes filled with mockery. Stephen, have you forgotten? Your Pandora is still waiting for you to return. There's nothing between us. Stephen nearly roared. It's all a misunderstanding. I can explain. No need. Louise cut him off, her voice terrifyingly calm. Whatever's between you and her is none of my concern. She paused, her gaze turning completely icy. Stephen, I'll say this one last time. I never loved you to begin with. The words struck like a sharp blade, plunging straight into Stephen's heart. His breath hitched abruptly, his entire body plunging into an icy abyss. Louise didn't spare him another glance as she turned and walked away side by side with Sean. Her retreating figure was resolute and indifferent. As if there had never been any connection between them, Stephen stood rooted to the spot, watching her figure gradually disappear from view, his chest churning with unprecedented pain and fury. He didn't believe it. He didn't believe she had never truly loved him. He didn't believe all that tenderness and devotion had been nothing but pretense. Louise, he suddenly shouted at her retreating figure, his voice terrifyingly hoarse. Do you think it ends like this? I'm telling you, impossible. Louise didn't pause her steps for even a moment, nor did she turn her head. Stephen slammed his fist violently against the tree trunk beside him, his knuckles instantly oozing blood. The pain from his hand paled in comparison to the torment in his heart. He stared fixedly in the direction she had left, his gaze dark and frenzied. I won't let go. Absolutely not. Stephen stood in the courtyard, blood dripping from his knuckles, yet he felt no pain. His gaze was fixed on the direction where Louise had disappeared, his chest churning with unprecedented violence and regret. Stephen, the assistant hurried over, holding a document folder with a grave expression. We've found it. Stephen slowly withdrew his gaze, his voice as cold as ice. What is this? The assistant hesitated for a moment before handing over the document folder. This is Miss Pandora's actions against Madam over all these years. Stephen grabbed the document folder and tore it open roughly. Inside were a stack of photos, surveillance screenshots, and audio recordings. He flipped through a few casually when suddenly his pupils constricted sharply. In the photo, Pandora stands at the stairwell, deliberately spilling water on the steps while making sure no one is around. In the surveillance footage, she takes advantage of Louise's inattention to secretly replace her medication with laxatives, and there's an audio recording. That stupid woman, I just had to play the victim a little, and Stephen believed me. She deserved what she got. Stephen's fingers clenched tighter and tighter, the paper crumpling into a ball in his palm. His breathing grew heavier, a terrifying storm brewing in the depths of his eyes, and also, the assistant swallowed hard before handing over another medical report. When Madam was locked in the basement, Miss Pandora had someone release a bag of rats inside. Stephen's temple throbbed violently, a deafening buzz exploded in his mind, as if something had collapsed with a thunderous crash. He remembered that day. Louise was locked in the basement all night, and when she came out the next day, her face was deathly pale, her whole body trembling. He thought she was just being melodramatic, even sneering and mocking her. Just one night locked up. Why cry all night? But what she said at the time was, Pandora let the rats in. Yet he didn't believe her at all. Stephen's chest heaved violently as an unprecedented rage surged through his entire body. He slammed the documents onto the ground, his voice terrifyingly hoarse. Pandora, where is she now? The assistant took half a step back, frightened by the ferocity in his eyes. At the Kalin family's villa, Stephen turned and left, his steps so fast they almost stirred the wind. He pulled out his phone and dialed the head of security, his voice cold as ice. "Lock Pandora in the basement, now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Stephen, do you not understand human speech?" Stephen's voice was utterly sinister. "Lock her up and take good care of her. I want her to taste, 1,000 times over, everything she once did to Louise." Kalin family villa. Pandora was leisurely painting her nails on the sofa, humming a tune. She had just received news that Stephen went to City End to find Louise. Though annoyed, she was certain that with Louise's stubborn temper, she would never forgive him so easily. Just a little more fuel to the fire, Stephen would eventually grow utterly disgusted with that woman, as she was lost in thought. The villa's front door was suddenly kicked open with a violent crash. Pandora, startled, looked up to see Stephen striding in, his face terrifyingly dark, her heart clenched. But she quickly put on a pitiful expression. "Stephen, how could you?" Before she could finish speaking, Stephen grabbed her by the throat and slammed her against the wall. "Pandora," his voice was so low it sounded like a demon crawling out of hell. "You're quite the schemer." Pandora gasped for breath, her face flushed crimson as she desperately pounded on his arm. "Stephen, what are you doing? Let me go." Stephen let out a cold laugh before abruptly releasing his grip. Pandora collapsed to the floor, clutching her throat as she coughed violently, tears and mucus smeared across her face. "Drag her away." Stephen looked at her as if she were trash. "Lock her in the basement." The bodyguards immediately stepped forward, grabbing Pandora and dragging her toward the basement. Pandora finally panicked, struggling and screaming. "Stephen, are you insane? How dare you touch me? Have you forgotten who's always been by your side? Have you forgotten that Louise never loved you?" Stephen's gaze grew even colder. He slowly crouched down, gripping her chin with a force that nearly crushed her bones. "Pandora, listen well. Starting today, I will make your life a living hell." With that, he violently shoved her away and coldly ordered the bodyguard, "Release a bag of rats inside. Let her enjoy herself thoroughly." Pandora's face instantly turned deathly pale. "No, don't, Stephen, you can't do this to me." "Ah." Her screams were cut off by the heavy iron door. Stephen stood at the basement entrance, his expression darkening to an extreme degree. How much he had once indulged Pandora, he now hated her just as much, even more. He hated himself. City's snow fell suddenly. Stephen stood at the entrance of Louise's guest house, a thin layer of snow dusting his black coat, his fingertips red from the cold, yet still clutching that document bag with a death grip. He stared at the tightly shut door, his Adam's apple bobbing, before finally raising his hand to knock. The door opened. Louise stood at the doorway, her expression unreadable as she saw him. "What do you want?" Stephen felt his breath catch slightly. He thought he would have so much to say when he saw her again, but when the moment truly came, he found his throat blocked by something, unable to squeeze out a single word. His voice was hoarse as he extended the file folder toward her. "I hope you'll take a look." Louise's gaze fell on the file but she didn't take it. "What is it?" "Pandora's actions against you." Stephen's fingertips trembled slightly. "I just found out she's been framing you all along. These are the proofs." Louise showed not a trace of surprise upon hearing this, merely averting her gaze calmly. "Oh, I don't care about that anymore." Stephen's heart sank abruptly. He had expected her to be furious, to feel wronged, even to demand why he had come only now. Yet all she offered was an offhand remark. She didn't care anymore. "I've already punished her," he added hastily, as if desperate to prove something. "And your parents, I also." "Stephen," Louise interrupted him with cold eyes. "Why do you still blame everything on others at this point?" He froze. "Are you completely blameless?" She stared straight at him, her voice soft yet each word cutting like a knife. "When Pandora did those things to me, didn't you enable it?" Stephen's breath hitched, his heart feeling as if it had been violently clenched. He wanted to retort, but when the words reached his lips, he found himself unable to utter a single word. Yeah, what right does he have to shift all the blame onto Pandora? It was him who chose to believe in Pandora time and again, who repeatedly overlooked Louise's grievances, and even pushed her into the abyss with his own hands when she needed him most. His voice was hoarse, carrying a trace of wretched bitterness. "I'm sorry." Louise shook her head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "No need to apologize. It's meaningless to say these things now anyway." She paused, then suddenly raised her left hand, the diamond ring on her ring finger refracting a dazzling light under the glow. "I'm already married." Stephen's pupils suddenly constricted, his entire body as if struck by lightning. He stared fixedly at the ring, a buzz sounding in his mind as if something had collapsed with a crash. "You." His voice was hoarse beyond recognition. "With whom?" Louise did not answer. Merely tilting her head to look toward the door, Stephen followed her gaze. Sean stood not far away, holding a bag of groceries he just bought, his eyes coldly fixed in their direction. In an instant, Stephen's blood seemed to freeze. Louise said in a tone so calm it was almost cruel, "Stephen, we're over. Don't ever disturb me again." With that, she turned and walked toward Sean, her back resolute, without a trace of hesitation. He knew that this time, he had truly and completely lost her. The snow fell heavier and heavier. Stephen had no idea how he made it back to the car. He sat in the driver's seat, fingers clenched white-knuckled around the steering wheel, veins bulging grotesquely on the back of his hands. The snow outside the windshield blurred his vision, mirroring the chaos in his mind. He remembered the first time he saw Louise, standing quietly in the Zenner family's living room, demure and docile like an exquisite marionette. He remembered the kanji she cooked for him, the light she left on for him, all the grievances she endured for his sake. He remembered the look in her eyes when she last saw him, calm, indifferent. As if he were just an insignificant stranger. His heart felt as though it were being slowly sliced by a blunt knife, the pain so intense he could barely breathe. He suddenly slammed his fist against the steering wheel, and the horn let out a sharp, jarring sound, startlingly out of place in the silent snowy night. "Louise." He murmured her name in a hoarse, broken voice. But this time, no one would ever answer him again. Some mistakes ultimately require a lifetime of repentance.